Now I want to show you another important exception. Black to move can defend despite white's protected passed h-pawn. White to move would win, but based on taking the opposition. First, we must check if Black's king can make a successful counter-attack. So calculate yes in your head first. And then, of course, you have concluded that white is too quickly. Black's king has left the square, so the pawn just queens on its own. And then white's queen can win against the knight's pawn on the 7th rank. If you don't know the procedure, then you can find it in chapter 7, subsection Queen versus Pawns. Okay, so black's king must remain inside of the square of the protected passed h-pawn and must base its defensive concept on this. White, on the other hand, cannot win by just coming closer with the king and then advancing with the h-pawn and winning the g4 pawn, as after king takes g4, black will always be able to play king g6, taking the position and defending the key squares f5, g5 and h5 and holding the draw. So white's only winning concept is based on occupying one of the key squares with the king. The usual key squares here are f4, e4, d4 and d5. These are of course the usual key squares of the g4 pawn. Additionally, I can tell you that the further key squares are d6, d7, e7, f7 and g7. If white's king reaches one of these squares, then white will always win. And the defensive concept is of course based on opposition. Black must always take the appropriate form of opposition inside the square, of course, to reach the draw. So in this case we need more forms of opposition than in the previous cases. What is opposition? The general definition of opposition is as follows. If all the squares, all the edges, all the corners of the rectangle round the kings, all the 4 corners have the same color. In this case, they are all for A3, E3, E5, and A5. They are all black. In this case, we can talk about opposition. And so, black can take with king E5 the virtual opposition, the so-called virtual opposition. Black could also take the normal distant opposition, of course, but this would be a terrible mistake, as E3 is outside of the square of the protected passed pawn and it would queen on its own. So the only move after which the all corners of the rectangle have the same colors as king E5. Okay, white then tries king A4. And now black has 2 moves to take the opposition. King E4, the normal distant opposition, and king E6, the virtual opposition. Again, in this case, all corners are light. E4, A4, A6, and E6. All corners are light. But only one of the 2 moves only one move is right. The virtual opposition loses. As now white's king advances on the key squares and black is not able to defend them anymore. Black can take the virtual opposition or the diagonal opposition. It doesn't change. If black takes a virtual opposition, then white's king just comes closer and closer, and black cannot defend. White has reached the key square and black cannot defend by definition. And the usual maneuver wins the g4 pawn. And if black takes the diagonal position, then white just advances on the key squares and there's nothing which can stop white from winning the g4 pawn. So black must take the normal distant opposition in order to draw, to defend the key squares. After king b3, black has 4 moves which take the opposition, but only one of them is right. f3 and d3 are wrong because they are not inside of the square, of course, and f5 is wrong. Yeah, why? Press the button and think for yourself until you have found the only winning move, which is king b4. As black can now take the distant opposition, as he cannot go to f4, he cannot fly to d4 for the normal opposition, and taking the virtual opposition loses, as white approaches on the key squares, winning the g4 pawn. So the only move to draw is taking the diagonal opposition. And now the only move to draw is taking the normal, usual opposition. Taking the diagonal opposition loses as white's king approaches on the key squares as usual. And after king e3, again the only move is taking the virtual opposition, as the other 3 moves taking the opposition are outside of the square of the h-pawn. Now there are more than one moves, but you just keep it simple and keep the virtual opposition, the usual virtual opposition. King e6 would be the distant virtual opposition, but okay, you of course take the usual virtual opposition. And now you have only one move to take the position, as f4 you cannot go to f4. And king e5 would be wrong. White could take the distant opposition, and it would be wrong, but because it would be no opposition, just to explain. Now this is a rectangle around the kings, but 2 corners are black, b2 and e5, and 2 corners are light, e2 and b5, and so it is no opposition. And white would win, by the way, with king c3 taking the diagonal opposition. Okay, so the only move to draw is taking the diagonal opposition. Now again the only move is taking the diagonal opposition. And now you, for reasons of simplicity and of the concept, you of course take the distant opposition and you keep the draw. Okay, now let's see at a more difficult example where this position plays a key role. The famous Cuban world champion, José Raúl Capablanca, visited Russia before the First World War and played a simultaneous display in St. Petersburg against Kalantarov, who was advised by no less than the famous Romanovsky. This night end game should be completely drawn, but much to the surprise of Kalantarov, Capablanca uncorked the king f6 quickly and confidently. And Kalantarov thought, okay, he must underestimate me and he's just playing too quickly and making a terrible mistake, because it seems that in the pawn endgame, black's a strong outside passed h-pawn gives him an advantage, gives black an advantage. This seems at first sight, but it's completely deceptive, as white has one very strong winning move now. Of course, Kalantarov should have remained in the knight endgame, and after king f6, white has 2 connected passed pawns, I have to admit, but the passed distant a-pawn will divert one of white's forces, the king or the knight, and then white will not be able to convert his pawns, and black's forces will be able to stop them and keep the draw, as the knight pawn, the a-pawn is really very far away, and one of white's units will be diverted. Yeah. So the simplification at the pawn game was a terrible mistake. Simplification at the pawn games must always be treated with great care. Yes, you cannot. The pawn games have a very definitive character. If they are lost, then you will most probably also lose. So don't exchange your last defensive unit without being sure that the pawn game really is wrong. Yeah, think for yourself. which is the only winning move, which was uncorked quickly and confidently by the great Cuban world champion, José Raúl Capablanca. Of course, he was not world champion in this moment, but his talent was already evident and his endgame skills were already famous. Yeah, the first usual move, King e6, would be of course completely wrong, as now the distant passed pawn would be a great asset in the pawn endgame, and black would even be winning due to that. Well, this is an important guideline. Remember that. Distant passed pawns are very strong in pawn endgames, usually. Black just plays g4 to make white's h-pawn backward. White goes into the square, and black's king comes, and black is winning easily. Oh, excuse me, we shouldn't take a different route. And black is winning easily. Okay, now white is inside of the square of the pawn. Now remember that for a pawn on the 7th rank, the square must start on the 6th rank, but it doesn't help, as we have seen. Next, okay, with white's king going to the queen side even loses, so the next chance is to create a breakthrough on the king side. There are two possibilities for this breakthrough. The first usual is h4. And indeed, after g takes h4, this breakthrough succeeds. g4 and white wins. As black queens first, but white's mating attack wins easily. Okay, white could also win the queen with queen h8 check, but mate is better than winning the queen, of course. But black can defend if he remembers about the Van Nijveld position we have just looked at. g4. And now, the constellation on the king side will be remembered by you. White's king will be able to enter the square of the a-pawn and to win the a-pawn, as black's king must remain in the square of the h-pawn, not being able to defend the a-pawn, of course. White's king will be able to win the a-pawn, but then black will take the right form of opposition and draw. Let's see. White enters the square, wins the pawn. Black must of course now avoid the mined square. King e5 would be a terrible mistake, as white would then win the h-pawn, taking the distant opposition and winning, as we already know. So he tiptoes round the mined square. Okay, white tries the last trick. Again, tiptoeing around the square. And now black takes the distant opposition and draws. We can see this. And now I will explain why the key squares take this strange route are not... Oh, excuse me. Why the key squares take this strange route are not like this, but take this strange route. The reason is that black and any human would do this, can now defend easily by taking the normal opposition, and then defending even these key squares. But in this exceptional case, black can also take the diagonal opposition, as it doesn't, as entering on the 8th rank doesn't help white's king, as he cannot win the fight for these key squares now. No, black just takes the position and draws. Black could, in this case, even defend with king h5, as king g7 and h7 are stalemate, and after king g8, black again takes the position, defends the key squares, and draws. Okay. So, the only winning move is a surprising g4, threatening to enterprise a decisive breakthrough with h4. After a5, h4 would simply win. Taking and g5 h3, g6, and white would mate. Even with the tempo to spare, even with h1 queen, white would still win like this. And after a4, black is also one tempo too slow. If he could play a1 queen now, then he would defend, but as matters are, white simply mates. Okay. So this doesn't help, and black tries the last attempt to stop the breakthrough with the king h7. White has to make the breakthrough, of course, threatening to take on g5, so black has to defend. And again, the only way to make progress is to threaten the breakthrough with king f6. If black takes now on a4, white wins by check and king f7, and the g-pawn will queen and win. So black tries the defense with the king h7. And again, white has only one winning move. King takes g5 is of course wrong, as it leaves the square of the pawn. Now white can't enter the square. You see how useful this rule is. You can easily see this immediately and don't have to make any calculations. So this must be a question mark. And taking on g5 is also wrong. Just king g8. Now the g-pawns will not queen. White's king must go to the a-pawn, win the a-pawn, and in that time black's king will just eat the g-pawns and draw. So the only move to win is creating a passed pawn, protected passed pawn with h5. This is possible as white's king is inside the square of the a7 pawn. Remember, the pawn is on its second rank, so you must take the square from one square further, like this. But white's king is just inside the square, so Capablanca played h5. Kalatarov tried a5, Capablanca entered the square, and now Kalatarov resigned. Let's see why. Capablanca's king will just stop and win the a-pawn. And then in the next step, he will win as incomplete. Here no opposition defense is possible. Big difference to the previous example with the protected passed pawn on h4. The square is now very small, and the key squares are not all inside of the square. The keys squares d5 and d6 are outside of the squares of the square of the protected passed h-pawn, and the white always wins. White's king just comes closer. Black defends with a diagonal opposition for the moment, preventing white entering the key square d5. But white just uses the fact that d6 is outside of the square of the protected passed pawn. And now black cannot stop white from entering a key square and winning the g5 pawn, and then winning easily. Okay, I advise you to study the previous position with the pawn on h4 very carefully, the Van position, and make sure that you really understand every form of opposition correctly. Because opposition is an extremely important fighting technique in pawn endgames.